On May 28, 1905, the Battle of Tsushima ended with a Japanese victory. It was the most important naval battle in world history since Trafalgar, with Admiral Heiichiro Togo even being called the Nelson of the East. Aboard the cruiser Nishin, a young ensign named Isoroku Takano was serving as a gunnery officer. One of the guns next to him exploded, shrapnel flying through the air at random. The index and middle fingers on his left hand remained attached only by thin pieces of skin. Had he lost a third, Takano would have been discharged from the Imperial Navy, his rising career shot down almost as soon as it began. He never would have been adopted by the Yamamoto family, never would have become commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, and never would have developed a plan to attack the US Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. This is the world of Takano's third finger, in which there was never a date that lives in infamy. Witness what could have been had the clash for supremacy in the Pacific between Japan and the United States never taken place. This is my first attempt at making a work of alternate history fiction on the channel, so feedback in the comments is most appreciated. I will still be providing endnotes for contextual purposes, so be sure to check those, link in the description. This series will also be based on information already presented in my video, The Invasion That Doomed Japan, so check it out if you haven't already. But for now, watch as the loss of a single extra finger transforms the 20th century. In the summer and autumn of 1941, Japan's military leadership began to prepare for an offensive into what was called the Southern Resource Area. The most important European colonial possession was the Dutch East Indies, which would grant Japan enough oil to compensate for the American embargo and fuel their war effort in China indefinitely. Yet war with the Netherlands alone was an impossibility, for the Japanese unequivocally knew Great Britain would provide material assistance. Malaysia, Singapore, Burma, and New Guinea had to be occupied as well. The final defeat of the world's largest empire was expected to come at the hands of Japan's ally, Nazi Germany. For decades prior to 1941, Japanese plans for southward expansion had included plans for war with the United States, in addition to Great Britain and the Netherlands. No separate war plans were ever made, as it was an article of faith in the Imperial Navy that Great Britain and the United States were strategically inseparable. This view was challenged by Admiral Nagano, chief of the Gunreibu, or Naval General Staff. Nagano recognized that if Japan did not attack any American territory in the Pacific, it would be impossible for President Franklin Delano Roosevelt to convince Congress or the public to declare war in defense of the British and Dutch. This plan received support from Vice Admiral Ryunosuke Kusaka, Chief of Staff of the Combined Fleet, Vice Admiral Nobutake Kondo, Commander of the Second Fleet, and Admiral Shigetaro Shimada, Minister of the Navy. This view was already endorsed by Prime Minister Hideki Tojo and subsequently adopted at the 62nd Liaison Conference on October 27th. In Hawaii, December 7th was just another peaceful Sunday. The US Pacific Fleet's battleships remained afloat in Pearl Harbor, and the tropical paradise, like the rest of the nation, remained quiet. The same could not be said for the Allied colonies in the Pacific. Hong Kong was the first to fall. Geographically vulnerable to the Japanese armies already in China, the city fell by Christmas Day. The Royal Navy's minuscule presence in the Far East was swiftly dealt with, as the battleship HMS Prince of Wales and battlecruiser HMS Repulse were sunk by Japanese aircraft on December 10th. Over the skies of Malaya, the Royal Air Force was swept into the dustbin of history, and it seemed that the rest of the British Empire would follow. In the United States, the Japanese offensives against the European colonies came as no surprise to Roosevelt. After all, it had been recognized by Washington as Japan's best move. The president went before Congress and explained why he believed that a Japanese occupation of Batavia and Singapore was as dangerous to the security of the nation as an occupation of San Francisco and Honolulu, and asked for a declaration of war. He privately doubted that an isolationist-infested Congress would actually comply, but in his mind, it was worth a shot. On the same day, December 9th in the Philippines, President Manuel Quezon, with the approval of General Douglas MacArthur, issued a unilateral declaration of Philippine neutrality. The Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs responded the next day with a pledge to respect Quezon's declaration. This was a political embarrassment for Roosevelt and only added fuel to the fire of American isolationism. Newspapers such as the Chicago Tribune, exploiting the December 4th Rainbow 5 leak, launched a frenzy of attacks accusing FDR of being a warmonger. Debate raged on in Congress for months, and the anti-war movement exploded, with wives and mothers demanding that their husbands and sons not be sent to die on the other side of the Pacific for the sake of European colonial empires. Even if Congress had declared war, the military reality still would have forced the Roosevelt administration to stand aside, as the Japanese swept through Southeast Asia with speed unseen since Hitler's conquest of Western Europe. Tomoyuki Yamashita, arguably Japan's best general, swept through Malaya and captured Singapore, the Gibraltar of the East, on February 15th, 1942. By this point in time, most of the East Indies had been occupied by Japan, although the Dutch didn't surrender until March. Prime Minister Winston Churchill described the fall of Singapore as, quote, the worst disaster and largest capitulation British British history, and it was this defeat that solidified American opposition to the war. It now seemed inevitable that Japan would win, and the United States could do seemingly nothing to reverse the defeats the Allies had suffered. On March 6, 1942, Congress formally rejected Roosevelt's request for a declaration of war. Churchill, who had gambled on American intervention to save Britain from defeat, was now more terrified than he had ever been in the summer of 1940. The worst-case scenario for both the president and the prime minister had come true. The British Empire was under assault from both sides of the Eurasian continent, and the United States was helpless to do anything about it. A week after Singapore fell, British resistance in Burma collapsed following the Battle of Satang Bridge. The road to India and the Middle East was now wide open. The prospect of a westward move had great incentives. The Royal Navy's Eastern Fleet, the only force capable of threatening the Imperial Navy's dominance of the seas, was being reinforced despite prior losses and the Royal Navy's commitments to the Mediterranean and the Atlantic. Thus, it was imperative of the Japanese that this fleet be destroyed. The Imperial Army was similarly enthusiastic about the concept, hoping to link up with Field Marshal Irvin Rommel as the Africa Corps advanced in Egypt. But a physical conquest of India was a daunting task. The sheer size and population of the subcontinent made it logistically unfeasible, especially with ongoing operations in China and Southeast Asia. Instead, the Army and Navy agreed to invade the island of Ceylon. Control of Ceylon would isolate India and the Middle East from the rest of the British Empire, making direct assaults on these regions unnecessary. The first move in the Indian campaign was the occupation of the Andaman Islands on March 23rd, denying the British a base to conduct a counter-invasion of Malaya and Sumatra. On the 26th, Vice Admiral Jisuburo Ozawa, the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, departed with a mission to seek out and destroy the Eastern Fleet. The naval balance heavily favored Ozawa over the Eastern Fleet's commander-in-chief, Admiral Sir James Somerville. On Easter Sunday, Japanese aircraft pounded Colombo and sank 2 British heavy cruisers spotted 200 miles south of Ceylon. Ozawa extended search operations in the direction the cruisers were heading and began to advance, making contact with the main body of the Eastern Fleet. The next day, in what became known as the Battle of the Indian Ocean, the combined fleet exploited its air superiority and overwhelming advantage in firepower to annihilate the British surface fleet. 2 centuries of British supremacy in the Indian Ocean were sent to Davy Jones's locker. Ozawa sailed north back to Ceylon, supporting an amphibious landing of 2 divisions led by Lieutenant General Masaharu Hama. The conquest of Ceylon and the destruction of the Eastern Fleet shut down British shipping in the Indian Ocean. India's economy, heavily dependent on trade, collapsed, along with British authority in the subcontinent. Armed revolutions supported by the Japanese tore through the empire's crown jewel. Australia and New Zealand, isolated from London, signed a separate peace to avoid being invaded as well. Britain's main sources of manpower and rubber were now gone. In North Africa, the 8th Army, isolated from supply, was smashed by the Africa Corps, and the British position in the Middle East quickly crumbled. Churchill was forced to resign after a vote of no confidence in July, with his Foreign Secretary, Anthony Eden, succeeding him. Before Parliament voted, Churchill reportedly told Eden, quote, "With so much of the weight of Japan thrown upon us, we have more than we can bear." The chiefs of staff were far more blunt, and told the new Prime Minister that the war was lost. On November 7th, Britain's status as a world power came to an end with the signing of the Treaty of Stockholm. German and Italian gains in Europe and the Middle East and Japanese gains in the Far East were recognized, as Japan annexed Hong Kong, Ceylon, New Guinea, and several Pacific islands, with the independence of Annam, Cambodia, Java, Burma, and, most humiliatingly, India was recognized. While no military restrictions were placed on Britain, the empire was now a shadow of its former self. London turned its back on the old world and looked to Washington for the economic and military aid necessary for the bankrupt island to survive. With Britain no longer a colonial power in the Far East, the Chinese United Front was isolated from foreign assistance. 2 months before the Treaty of Stockholm was signed, Operation Go-Go, the Japanese assault on Sichuan, had begun. With no possibility of foreign assistance, Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong's struggle was doomed to fail. By the end of 1943, Chongqing had fallen, the United Front had collapsed, and Wang Jingwei's reorganized national government stood triumphant as the sole government in China. After more than 7 long years, the Greater East Asia War, as Japan's conflicts with China and the European powers came to be known, had finally come to an end. In November of that year, the Greater East Asia Conference convened in Tokyo, attended by representatives of the nations quote-unquote liberated by Japan. They signed the Greater East Asia Charter on the 6th, officially forming the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. The signatories had to allow Japanese troops to be stationed within their countries, officially for the collective security of the region, but in reality to ensure compliance with Tokyo's vision. Similar to Manchukuo, the Imperial Army held de facto authority and almost complete freedom of action in how the member states were administered, while the puppet governments only held nominal control. Each government was ruled by political parties modeled after Japan's Imperial Rule Assistance Association, with policies promoting assimilation into Japanese culture and perversion conversion of local religions and languages. All non-Japanese member states were required to be simultaneously self-sufficient while maintaining large exports of raw materials to Japan, an imbalance of trade that was only sustainable through increasingly draconian policies. East Asia remained bound by the shackles of empire, just with a new master much closer to home. The only military power left in the Western Pacific capable of challenging Japan's enslavement of East Asia was the United States with its presence in the Philippines. This was rectified by peaceful means with the signing of the Treaty of Manila on July 4th, 1944 by Roosevelt and Quezon. In accordance with the treaty's stipulations, the United States transferred its own bases to the newly independent government. Manila wisely rejected an offer to join the co-prosperity sphere, choosing instead to follow a policy of neutrality in the Pacific, out of a desire to spare the country from devastation in the event of war. Nagano's plan had paid off, and Japan was awarded with an empire spanning half of the human population. The rising sun shone over the peaks of the Himalayas and lit the depths of the Mariana Trench. The empire's hold over Asia was immensely strengthened by Britain's defeat, as Germany now turned its full attention against the Soviet Union. By the time the Philippines gained their independence, the Red Army, suffering from debilitating manpower shortages, was no longer capable of holding back the Nazi advance. The Russian capital of Moscow finally fell in the autumn of 1944. Stalin fled the city, only to be overthrown and executed in a coup. The subsequent infighting obliterated whatever organization remained in the Soviet Union and its military. The Kwantung Army based in Manchukuo took advantage of the chaos to occupy all of Siberia east of Lake Baikal, establishing a White Russian puppet state. With the Axis powers seemingly closing in from both sides, only now did the American people awaken to the threat of Germany and Japan, but the opportunity to stop them was long gone. With China subdued, Russia shattered, and Britain bankrupt, there was little chance of prosecuting a two-ocean war to break Axis control over Europe, North Africa, the Middle East, India, China, and East Asia with any chance of success. Following the wartime agreements made with Britain, over the objections of Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, the United States began focusing on breaking Nazi power in Europe. This gave Tokyo some breathing room to consolidate its empire after 14 years of non-stop expansion. But the task of transforming the co-prosperity sphere into a world power to rival America or Germany was daunting, and Japan's quest to do so would shape the rest of the century. I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know if you want to see a continuation of this timeline in the comments section down below. I'm the Counterfactor, and thanks for watching.